and ancient mysteries, but in Ethiopia, I got drawn into the story of the Ark of the Covenant. The fact that Ethiopia claims to possess the lost Ark of the Covenant. And when we're back in Cairo, one of the 3 talks I will give will be about the Ark of the Covenant. So this is just a little bit of, let's say, on the ground detail about that. Because here's the problem. If the Ark of the Covenant is in Ethiopia, how did it get there from Jerusalem? It's an awfully long way. And we know that the Ark of the Covenant was placed in the Holy of Holies of the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem. And from there, at some point, it vanished. And in my research, I was able to establish pretty conclusively that the Ark of the Covenant had been removed from the Temple of Solomon about 50 years before the Babylonian invasion. Jerusalem was invaded by the Babylonians in 587 BC. But by around 650 BC, there are a number of haunting passages in the Old Testament which suggest that it's already gone. And I began to home in on this, and it became clear that what had happened was that a king had taken the throne in Israel whose name was Manasseh, and he was an apostate, and he had returned to the old pagan religion, and he had installed a pagan idol in the Holy of Holies of the Temple of Solomon. And that, I discussed with biblical scholars, that turned out to be the reason why the Ark of the Covenant was taken out of the temple. But where had it been taken to? And that's where a great mystery arises, because on this very island, in 650 BC, give or take 5 years, a Jewish temple was built. And this was in the first temple period. It's completely unheard of that there should be any other temple but the Temple of Solomon. And yet, a Jewish temple was built here, and we know it was built here. Now, there was a Jewish community lived on this island, quite a large community, and they'd been here for at least 100 years before that. And they served as soldiers and guards, working for the Egyptians, defending the southern border of Egypt, which was pretty much here. They defended the southern border of Egypt, so there was already a Jewish community. And then suddenly, around 650 BC, a gigantic Jewish temple is built here, even though the Temple of Solomon still exists in Jerusalem. And that gigantic Jewish temple was built with the exact same dimensions as the Temple of Solomon, and with the exact same materials. And we know this. The temple has not survived. It's been utterly destroyed. But we know that this happened because there was correspondence, went back and forward between the Jewish community here in Egypt and Jerusalem. And this correspondence was written on what is called ostraka, which is potsherds. And many of those potsherds have survived, and they contain references to the temple and to the size of the temple and to the building of the temple. And there was only one justification for the building of a temple at that time, and that was as an house of rest for the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord. So suddenly the pieces started to come together, and I began to reason that this made sense, that the Ark of the Covenant had been taken out of the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem, and it had been brought here in 650 BC. That's why the Babylonians never found it. They took all the other temple treasures, they listed and detailed and itemized them, and they carried them off to Babylon and eventually returned them some 70 years later. But the Ark of the Covenant was never amongst them. I believe it was here. Now the next stage of the story concerns the black Jews of Ethiopia. They call themselves the Beta Israel, the House of Israel. They're often referred to as the Falashas. And they have traditions and stories. And these days, all the Ethiopian Jews are actually living in Israel. But at that time, when I was traveling in Ethiopia in the 1980s, they were all still there in their traditional villages. And they told me a story about how their ancestors had got to Ethiopia bringing the Ark of the Covenant. And they said before they came to Ethiopia, they lived on an island in the Nile. So I began to look into this much more closely, what was going on here. It turned out that that Jewish community from 650 BC down until about 400 BC coexisted fairly comfortably with the Egyptian population on this island. But there was a problem. As you have observed, there is an Egyptian temple on this island. And who is that temple dedicated to? That temple is dedicated to the god Khnum. And the god Khnum was the principal sacrificial animal in ancient Judaic ceremony, if not the ram. Okay, so the Jews on Elephantine were sacrificing rams, and this caused a conflict with the Egyptians, and the Jewish community was driven out. There's no evidence that they went north through a hostile Egypt. I believe they went south. They followed the Nile River system, south from here, south into the Sudan, until they came to the junction of the two Niles, the Blue Nile and the White Nile. And then they followed the Blue Nile up into the highlands of Ethiopia, because the Blue Nile rises in Lake Tana. And indeed those Falashas told me that their first place of residence in Ethiopia was on an island in Lake Tana. And I was able to track that island down and the traditions associated with it. So that's really what I wanted to say to you, that there's a very important piece of history here on this island, as we stand surrounded by the Temple of Khnum. And if you go up onto that viewing platform, and you can look down onto the housing area, that is the area where the Jewish community lived. When I first came here in 1990, the German Archaeological Institute were excavating on the site, and they had established they were not able to find any remains of the temple itself, but they found the remains of the housing of the Jewish population that lived on this island at this time. And you can see, looking down on the other side of the viewing platform, you can see where that housing area is. So that's the little story of the Ark of the Covenant on Elephantine Island here on the Nile. Thank you.